Good day, folks. Welcome to today's podcast, China's New Economic Model. Now, I mentioned in a previous podcast that China's export-led growth model is being amended, but I didn't elaborate on what that entailed. But here I will. So to do so, I'm going to have to go back to 1978, the official commencement date of reforms under former Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, pictured behind me. Now, reform is a tricky business. There's few examples of successful reforms in history. Normally, reforms run into elite opposition, they're quietly shelved, and the process of muddling through begins. There are some historical exceptions to this rule. The Tanzimat reforms of the late 19th century in the Ottoman Empire were one example of a successful reform, as is the Great Reform Bill in the 1840s under Prime Minister Earl Grey in Britain. Another example would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. However, the 1978 reforms under Deng Xiaoping are, by all accounts, a success. That's what really kick-started China's high-speed economic growth of consecutive years of 9 or 10% growth per annum. But it wasn't an easy process, and yes, there was elite opposition. The elite opposition came in a few forms, namely insiders within the Chinese government, such as those who advocated a more cautious, gradualist approach to economic reform, such as Chen Yun, and in the early days, and then in the later days there was other conservative opposition, such as Prime Minister Li Peng. But Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern Tour was a way of reaffirming official support for economic reform and brought reform back to the centre stage of Chinese politics. Well, going back to reform, the early stages were generally designed to eliminate constraints on growth, and one of the first moves was to allow farmers to sell their surpluses to a wider market. This ran in counterpart with the special economic zones, notably Shenzhen, where foreign direct investment was encouraged and could operate outside of official regulations. We see this happening now with the Shanghai Free Trade Area. However, back in the late 70s, the level of state restriction on private commerce was considerable, and the early agricultural reforms occurred after selling agricultural produce, and it required meetings of village committee. So it was very much a ground-up based reform. Again, reform included all sectors of the society, right down to the village committee. Now, this took place along with financial reform. So if we go back to 1980, there were only the four big Beijing banks, and more than 90% of loans were with these banks, notably Bank of China, Industrial Commercial Bank of China, Gongshan Yinghang, Construction Bank of China. I could be wrong, I won't go into them. Now it's 50-50, with the rest coming from local and provincial banks. You'll see them all throughout China, like Bank of Dandong, Bank of Baoding, as just a few examples. Now, what the growth model that China has followed, and perhaps not consciously, is often known as the Gerschenkron growth model, and it's named after the Ukrainian-born American economist Alexander Gerschenkron, who observed the trend. So the Gerschenkron growth model follows two components. The first component is the realization that developing countries lack savings and therefore struggle to invest in infrastructure. So there's two aspects, either reliance on foreign capital and forcing up the savings rate, and China has done both. First of all, household consumption. Increasing household savings is caused by contracting consumption. So, household consumption is decreased by taxation, and many taxes were used in the early stages of reform. And the taxes are designed to transfer wealth from households to other sectors, and also to force up savings. So, the interest rates were used to drive down consumption and drive up savings. And slow wage growth also is a factor. Wages have grown slower than productivity. So, by all accounts, China's model of forcing up savings and investing in the economy was a success. And China has the following: lowest household share of overall GDP ever recorded, lowest consumption share of GDP in the world, and high savings rate in the world, well, at least until recently. And the other component of the Gershon-Krohn growth model is short-term investments. These were essentially investments designed to get quick returns. Now, the investment process has to be centralized. So basically, contract household consumption and redirect it into infrastructure. Now, in a previous podcast, I may have said that China doesn't have so much an export-based economy as an investment-based economy. And the results of the investment-based economy can be seen all over if you visit China. My favourite example is the largest high-speed rail network in the world, and much else. But the infrastructure is very important. As Deng Xiaoping once said, if you want to get rich, build the road first. So there is a problem with this growth model. It's effective up to a point, which brings us to today, because inevitably growth stagnates. So, and this is what leads to what's commonly referred to as the middle income trap. So, in many ways, this podcast is about China escaping the middle income trap. When the growth reaches a certain point, institutions need to be reformed or investment is non-productive. And those who follow the model will find themselves building bridges to nowhere. Well, by bridges to nowhere, I mean basically pointless infrastructure that's built more for the purpose of creating jobs than adding any real value to the economy. Now, when I say bridges to nowhere, that's just a metaphoric term. It can take many forms. It could be pointless monuments, or it could be housing development that remains unsolved. And yes, there is a lot of that. So if China wants to avoid continually building bridges to nowhere, the model needs to be reformed. And the other essential counterpart to this is debt overhangs. Now, debt overhangs are never good for any economy, and we'll explore that very soon. Countries that follow the Gershon-Krohn model end up with unsustainable debt. And why does debt matter? Well, debt slows or inhibits growth, and China's economy is heavily indebted. There's no denying that. So there are virtually no cases when countries have grown themselves out of debt. Some people say that the US grew itself out of debt with the New Deal, but that can be disputed. One example could be that Britain grew itself out of debt following the Napoleonic Wars. However, this again can be disputed, and it's not the purpose of this podcast to debate this. So the next stage is to reverse the model and basically turn the engine off. And this is designed to allow resources to be used more productively. So this means switch off the engine, slow down growth, because excessive economic growth overheats the economy, meaning both debt and inflation. And well, nobody likes that old thief inflation. So, how do you address the problem of debt? Well, the burden of debt has to be transferred to a sector of the economy. Well, none of these options are very good, and some are very, very bad, as we will explore. Uh, Indeed, some are quite frankly terrible. Well, what first option? Inflate the debt away. Well, well, not a good example, a bad example of this was Germany after World War One in the hyperinflation of the 1920s. The terms of reparation for the First World War imposed by the Versailles Treaty resulted in basically impossible reparations. And this pushed the Reichsbank into hyperinflation. Um, it does render the debt obsolete by increasing prices, but so are average people's savings. Why was hyperinflation in Germany so bad? Well, all of a sudden you wake up to find your savings are worthless. You have to use a wheelbarrow just to buy a bread loaf. I think there was an economic, a public opinion poll survey in Germany sometime in the 2000s, and it was asked, "What do you fear most in life?" Number two was cancer. Number one was hyperinflation. So even 100 years later, the hyperinflation heavily hangs in the collective conscious of Germany. So hyperinflation, yeah, let's dispense with that one. Um, Option two, the Romanian option. So this is essentially transfer the burden of debt to the citizens. So the Ceausescu government was granted most favoured nation status by the US. This was partly due to his opposition to the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia and him being something of a maverick in the communist world, mainly that he would not follow the Soviet line on foreign policy. Other examples were that Romania attended the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, which was boycotted by pretty much the rest of the Eastern Bloc. So the Ceausescus amassed massive debts from Western banks to pay for public infrastructure, notably the Palace of the Parliament, which is by some accounts the heaviest building in the world, and the heaviness of the debt was very high on the Romanian economy, which the transfer of the debt to the citizens basically meant severe austerity, higher taxes, and decreased consumption to the point of rationing. Now, I would add an extra caveat to this. There was the additional problem that the Ceausescus had this not so clever idea of removing all forms of birth control, which meant a massive population boom. And how did this work out for the Ceausescus? Not very well. So we'll dispense with the Romanian option. Now, another option, and this one is far more preferable, is a debt haircut, and this has been implemented before. It was used in 1997 by then Prime Minister Zhu Rongji, who implemented a bad bank program to write down toxic assets, basically debts that cannot be repaid. A major impetus was the 1997 Asian financial crisis, wherein countries with unsustainable pegs to the dollar found the dollar peg, they were forced to end the dollar peg, which resulted in massive capital flight, massive unemployment. There was blood on the streets, literally. China managed to avoid the 97 Asian financial crisis and dodged a bullet. So the bad bank, going back to the bad bank program, basically the debt is reduced. For example, a loan of $100 then becomes a loan of $50. Now, some people may say that this is more, but remember, lending money is also a form of gambling. So in this case, creditors just don't get their full return. Well, yeah, sorry guys, you should lend more carefully. And the other option is financial repression. Now, we've seen this very recently following the crash of 2008 and the subsequent Eurozone crisis. So, this involves reducing interest rates below the rate of inflation, negative interest rates. And this creates low returns for savers and allows companies to borrow cheaply. So, this is a way of kickstarting the economy. The thing is, it's already happening. It's very much a part of current practice. So this takes us to, well, what's new? What's new that needs to be done that hasn't been done already? Well, as I make this podcast, most of what I'm going to talk about is already being done. And as I said, China's new economic model is an ongoing process. It's a work in progress, as is many things. So again, some of the proposed routes, hyperinflation, transferring the debt to the workers, they're too painful to bear. And the main thing with China is stability maintenance. I mean, China's a country which pays massive attention to stability, and for very good reasons. I mean, the Taiping Rebellion of the 1860s resulted in a civil war which killed about 40 million. I mean, think about it, 40 million, that's practically the population of Poland. So more radical approaches need to be taken. The means to pay off the debt is there. It's there in the form of infrastructure, real estate, state-owned enterprises, things which can be privatised, or the official word in the Chinese lexicon is structural reform, if I remember correctly. Now, this was tabled under the previous government of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. I believe this was around 2008, but the trouble is it runs into this elite opposition or vested interests. So, in 2009, then Prime Minister Wen Jiabao gave a speech about further reforming and tackling government waste, but very little happened. Well, the vested interests pushed back. Who are the vested interests? Well, the vested interests often take the form of the managers of state-owned enterprises or local provincial government officials. I mean, how does it work? Well, think about it. The party secretary of, I don't know, X, Y, or Z province has family members in this particular construction project. They have this part of their constituency in this infrastructure project, and they don't want to upset them. So vested interests have previously pushed back and nothing got done. We just get back to muddling through. But now the situation is very much different, particularly since 2013 with the with Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. Now, the anti-corruption campaign has taken many forms, and it's not the purpose of this podcast to discuss that. However, maintaining inefficient public infrastructure for the sake of family or other forms of nepotism, well, that's pretty much a form of corruption. So the vested interests are not so willing to push back now. So regional authorities with stakes in moribund assets are no longer able to resist economic restructuring. So the 19th Party Congress in 2017 basically enshrined Xi Jinping with the authority to enact sweeping reform. Now, this leads us to the main part, which is liquidate the assets of local and provincial government. The assets are there, which are necessary to pay down the debt and increase income. And local and provincial government have these assets. So again, these are real estate and small estate owned enterprises, and they can be sold and maybe managed more efficiently. So the central government has been trying to do this since 2007, but again, the vested interests were able to resist until now. So adjustments are never painless. We see it. I see it in China all the time. People are more worried about their job security. People find themselves working more hours, basically to save for a rainy day. I see. I've seen it with my own eyes through my own interactions, and uh, adjustments are never painless. So again, it's unlikely that anyone can achieve constant GDP growth with an increase in consumption. So, a more likely outcome is for GDP growth to fall and consumption to remain stable. Now, um, so this means basically again slow down the engine, lower GDP growth. So, the days of 7% or more GDP growth are gone. And that might not be a bad thing because economic growth is one of the most fungible things imaginable. I mean, if you build basically anything, that counts as economic growth. And until recent years, provincial authorities were basically just saying build because higher GDP growth was a good way of getting promoted within the government hierarchy. So this takes us to the thing, is 2% GDP growth safe? Um, Looking at it from some aspects, in previous years, not really. Former President George Bush once spoke to his then Chinese counterpart Hu Jintao and he asked him what keeps you awake at night. And Mr. Hu answered, trying to create 25 million new jobs every year. Good answer. But that was then, this is now. So the previous orthodoxy was that China needed at least 7% annual GDP growth to avoid internal unrest. But this is no longer the case. China could actually be quite safe on 2% annual GDP growth. Most Chinese do not know nor care about GDP, but they do know about and care greatly about household income. GDP fetishism is never really a good thing, and we should be more suspicious of it. Unsold real estate and ghost towns count as GDP growth. So really, what use is unlimited GDP growth? And so do bridges to nowhere. They count as GDP growth. So the solution is axe GDP growth targets. Now, I'm not sure if this has actually happened, but it's likely that GDP growth targets will be shelved. Now, the next step is sell off the assets, and that comes down to the local and provincial governments. Now, this takes us to state-owned enterprises. Now, state-owned enterprises can be a very good thing. There's many very good Chinese state-owned enterprises. PetroChina, Sinopec, which by some accounts are the largest companies in the world. The banks have been very successful state-owned enterprises, as have, well, many things which have built infrastructure in the Chinese economy. So state-owned enterprises can be a very good thing. But there are some very moribund and useless state-owned enterprises that need to be either sold off or just shut down. So, but some, after a bit of reservicing, some adjustment, can be profitable again. You just need to push back against those vested interests. So that takes us to one of those things, privatisation. Well, I've heard I believe it was the late former chairman of the Standing Committee of the People's Congress Wu Bangguo, who said that China doesn't privatise. Well, China has and does privatise. It's just not called privatisation. It's called economic restructuring. And it's been done before and it is being done again. I mean, it's highly likely that politically favourable sales will prevail over more economically favourable sales, but where does that not happen? The other thing is increase household income. Now, who can really argue with that? Who wouldn't want to see their household income go up? So programs of boosting household incomes are already underway. In Shanghai, shares in state-owned enterprises are being issued to workers. In Shandong, state-owned assets are being transferred to pension funds, thereby reducing the savings burden on the household. The municipal and provincial government committees are already investigating every form of possible wealth transfer. So that old idea, redistribution of wealth, it's happening and it can happen. So that takes us to the issue of demand versus supply. China has a demand side problem, not a supply side problem. The intention of government to reform has been in place for over a decade, but was not able to overcome elite opposition until now. So this takes us to China's new growth model in the new era. So the key points to remember: China's growth model has had its day and it needs readjustment. Otherwise, debt will become unsustainable. And the assets to pay down the debt and increase household income are there. They just need to be wrested from the vested interests in the form of elite opposition. So, as I said earlier, China has an export-based growth model. It's the workshop of the world, but it's primarily an investment economy. By investment, I mean investment in public infrastructure. Well, the infrastructure's there. As to repeat the phrase by Deng Xiaoping, if you want to get rich, build the road first. The roads are there. The high-speed rail is there. We just need things to move in a more sustainable direction, and that part of that includes China becoming a consumption economy. Well, personally, in my humble opinion, China already is a consumption economy. People like their big cars. I see plenty of big cars on the road, and in recent years I've seen plenty of electric cars. In fact, I've literally been astonished by the rise of electric cars in China. Almost every time I took a ride in Didi, the Chinese version of Uber, it was almost always an electric car. Most of what I've discussed today is already well underway, and as I said earlier, nobody needs GDP fetishism. Nobody needs 10% growth rates anymore. People just need to be able to get richer. That was what Deng Xiaoping said in 1978. Socialism is not poverty. To get rich is glorious. And the Chinese people are getting richer. Thank you all.